This morning's scripture reading comes from the book of Mark, chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, and all will be thrown down." Then he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nations will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth of pangs." Amen.
I remember the first time I saw a real cathedral. Actually, I had seen the National Cathedral, but I'd read about the cathedral builders and was eager to see with my own eyes and feel that sense of awe standing in one of the cathedrals of Europe. And oh, did I see some of the greatest. I remember how my arm hairs stood on end when I entered Notre Dame. I climbed 1,000,000 stairs to get to the top to see those gargoyles up close and personal and look down across Paris. What big stones. Seriously, they're huge. Have you climbed them yourself? So many of you probably have. They're really big, awkward, high step stones. Of course, before I went to Europe or even DC to see churches built over lifetimes, this OC girl did make it over to the Crystal Cathedral, which housed old Reverend Schuler and his hour of power. Now, I grew up here in this church. Most of you know that. Over there in that small dome we call Plummer Hall now. So I was blown away by this big building and all the seats at the Crystal Cathedral. And of course, the first time I went was for none other than the glory of Christmas. Now, since I grew up here, when the church was a lot smaller than it is now, we put together these wonderful little pageants where the moms of our church and us kids would come together and we'd make up some funny play that ultimately rang true as we reimagined Jesus' birth anew. We didn't have any live animals, though. I mean, geez. More times than I like to admit, I actually played the livestock. But man, at the Crystal Cathedral, they had legit spitting camels. I even think they had an elephant trucking across the stage. I'm not really sure why, because I don't remember the elephants in the story, but it was a stage. And the angels, oh my gosh, have you seen those angels? The angels would fly across the sky, ropes and pulleys making miracles. It was an intense production. What a large building. What a glorious show. Like the disciples, my jaw was dropping, awed by the magnificence of this place. Now, I wouldn't say I was exactly jealous. Not then. But these were big churches. It's easy to feel small next to them. I'm not jealous now either, though, let me be clear. But I do look at all these big churches that literally surround us here in Orange County, and I wonder how, or even why sometimes. How are they so dang big? Jesus says to his disciples, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." Now, let me be clear. I do not think that Jesus spoke to his disciples 2,000 years ago about specific events that might happen today. Though this is definitely apocalyptic piece that we're looking at here. So it's just a coincidence that Notre Dame burned down and the Crystal Cathedral fell too. Okay, it didn't fall, it didn't shatter the glass or anything, but it did fall to the Roman Catholics. Now I hear they're right down the street from us, these Crystal Cathedral folks. But the truth is, it wasn't a coincidence with that, and it wasn't even a coincidence that the temple fell, because the Gospel of Mark was written after the destruction of the temple. So there's not a whole lot of real predictions going on here. This is a very good reminder that if you are going to make predictions, just write about the past, knowing the present, and your readers might never know the difference. So, all that aside, what might this scripture mean? Now, per usual in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples don't get it right away. You know, they're kind of dumb in this gospel. So they ooh and they ah at the size of the temple, the large stones, and just like us, they assume that bigger is better. And Jesus tells them that these great buildings with large stones will fall, not one of them left upon another. And the disciples cannot fathom what he is saying. So he has to do what he always does in the Gospel of Mark for these disciples, take them aside and explain everything to them. The most important thing he says, don't be led astray. That's a good one. Because man, is it easy to be led astray. I just envision these guys with their heads tilted up, oohing and ahhing, and Jesus trying to reel them in. Guys, eyes on me. Eyes on me. Because it's so easy to be impressed by the big stuff, the fancy publications, the big buildings with the coffee houses inside, and the really good videos, and the Snapchats, and the Instagram, and you know what I mean. Now, look, we like our coffee here too. And there's nothing wrong with, all that stuff. I kind of want an IUCC Snapchat, if there's anybody under 25 that can help me with that. But I think the point is how easily we get distracted by the big, the grand, and the cool. But that's not what lasts. And for as big and as impressive as the temple was, it did not last either. The wars, the nation against nation stuff, kingdom against kingdom, other great predictions, also nothing we're unfamiliar with. Look, he is not talking about our day and time. But oh, how he's talking about our day and time. Now, if he'd thrown pandemics in there, then we'd know it for sure. All this infighting, our inability to connect, our inability to fully ground ourselves, and our penchant for distraction. Bigger is better. That's all the more true today than it was then. It's all going to be wiped out, he warns. And that's what happened. The temple fell. And everybody thought the religion was done for. They thought Judaism would be over. And if we are to read this about ourselves, we might think the very same for Christianity. Done for. The pandemic wiped us out. Or our capitalism finally did it. Or who knows, our selfish greed finally did us in. Look, I could understand why any of us would think this. I could understand why the immediate response to the destroyed temple would mean a destroyed Judaism. I get why the first reaction is fear, despair, wringing of hands. How could a first century Jew imagine Judaism living on if the temple were destroyed? Something so big, so grand, so central to their tradition. It's like a Byzantine cathedral builder of the 12th century imagining their fortress of stone destroyed. Or a 1950s churchgoer who constantly contends with their neighbor for the best seat in a packed church, faced with the idea of empty pews. Or a 1990s Hour of Power viewer who thinks Schuler might just be Jesus' greatest disciple. How could they fall? It's unimaginable. And how? How could they possibly recover? They couldn't fathom it. How could the religion make it out of this? It must be the end. And then Jesus says this very strange thing. It's not the death of faith. It's the birthing pangs. This is but the beginning. This is but the beginning. If we were to look back, we know that Judaism survives past the fall of the temple. We know that Notre Dame survives that fire. And we know that the Crystal Cathedral moved next door to Irvine, Pres. And the building is, of course, the Orange County Diocese of the Roman Catholic Church. Everything changes. Man, that's hard to deal with, though. Change. It certainly was not what the disciples expected to hear. But here's the thing. This comes out of our gospel. And you remember what gospel means? Good news. There's good news here. This is birthing pains. This is labor. We're experiencing labor. And as any of us who have gone through knows, it is not easy. It is downright painful. It changes your life forever in some ways that you expected, but in many ways that you did not ever anticipate. And that is hard. But the truth is, it's beautiful too. I just celebrated the 7th anniversary of my 2.5 days of labor this week. So I definitely remember the pain, the struggle, and the fear. It's hard to imagine that something new could be even better than it was when it seems like all we can see is the pain, the destruction, the fear, the worry. Now, let me be clear, that's not all we feel. I mean, if you were in some of the meetings I was in this last week, maybe you'd feel that way. But if you have been here, Sunday morning after Sunday morning, if you have sat in this sanctuary, if you have listened to the same music that I've been listening to, and you feel the energy of this church, these people, then you know this is not a time for despair. Now, I'm going to get real with you for a minute. Yes, we are coming off 2 of the most challenging years we could have imagined, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But that said, this church is not actually a stranger to hard years. Now, we're a relatively young church in comparison to the rest of our denomination, but we have seen some lean years. We struggled to really get on our feet, and then it felt like once we did, man, it was golden. And then, of course, we've all heard this story and told this story a million times over. The pandemic hit, and it has been hard. It was completely unexpected, and it wasn't like we did anything to bring it on. It's not our fault. And yet we have been so fortunate that the pandemic has not wiped us out. I'm afraid that too many churches might not be able to get up from this. And at the same time, I don't need to remind you that even as it has been nearly 2 years since this pandemic shut our world down, it did not shut down our church. We did shut our physical doors, but oh no, this church did not close. This church did not shut down. Our preschool did. For several months, we didn't have any kids at all. We reopened, and we realized that this was going to be really hard to get kids back to school. We had to comply with new COVID guidelines. And just when we thought things were going to look up, we were predicting children to come back and people to come back to church. And as we've said so many times before, along came Delta. And people were reluctant to come to church, and parents were reluctant to send their kids to school. And we've been hovering over this break-even line for a few months with our preschool. And actually, the preschool has contributed some to our budget, but not to the extent that we'd hoped for by this time. The hardest part for us is trying to imagine when will parents feel comfortable sending their kids back, and when will we get back to capacity. So it's easy to fear that an earthquake is coming to knock down our stones. And we add to it this anxiety that some of us are feeling when we don't see a full church, We're thinking end times too. And I understand. I mean, I'm not blind. It always surprises me that we have more in first service than second service. It's like, what is going on? I know that some of you were used to seeing 300 people here on a Sunday, and now we're getting more like 115 between two services. If you compare it to the University Synagogue, it's actually not bad. But I understand the disappointment, and I feel it too sometimes. Lord knows it is easy to play the numbers game. Remember that whole bigger is better? Of course we want to be a big church. But let me be clear. It is not so people will ooh and ah, what big stones, look at all the people. It is because we want to share the good news of our progressive, inclusive beliefs about a God who loves all of us and wants to make this world a better place for everybody in it. A God who calls us to seek justice and who asks us to work to make it manifest here and now. We are blessed, and I am confident that we will get back up. These are growing pains, or better, as Jesus says, birthing pangs. Something new is growing among us. Now, the disciples in Mark, they don't get it. They just gawk at these big stones, wondering when they'll get the sign that all this is supposed to happen. And Jesus is telling them, don't fall astray. What they don't fully realize is that he's telling them that they are the ones who have to go through the labor pains to get to the new beginning. They have to remain committed to the vision even when they cannot fully fathom it themselves. And maybe that's where we are too. We can't get swayed by the big churches with all the fancy stuff, and we can't get too down and out about what we don't have or too fearful about the labor it's going to take to get us to this new beginning. But if we listen to Jesus, we know there is good news for us because he's inviting us to be his disciples, to carry on his work, to rebuild the church, or as we like to say, to refresh, reboot, and renew, reminding us that it ain't over yet. These are not the end times. It is our job to remain faithful. Faithful to this vision of inclusion for a kingdom of all. Faithful to this family here within these walls, and especially the ones who haven't felt quite ready to come back in yet. You are not forgotten. And, a big and, we have to be faithful to the ones we don't know yet. Those who are searching for a church that stands for something, that follows Jesus into the hard and the hurting places, that listens to the prophet's call and gets to work, seeking justice, sharing love. Yes, we do this for our family here who we know and we love and we miss so much, but we also do this for the ones who we don't know yet. The disciples, they didn't really get it at the time. They didn't know what Jesus was asking them, inviting them, asking them to take the lead, not just to follow him, but to take the reins as they walked into this new experience that would be bigger than any temple they stood gawking at. And so maybe we don't fully get it either. That's okay. But we are called to be his disciples today. And so, we dig deep. We give of ourselves. We pledge to be the church, not to the church. We pledge to be the church, to be bigger than this building or any other big stone structure we might ogle at. Stronger, too. Eager to see what is birthed from God's love and our own, believing that something even more than we've imagined is promised to be manifested together. And so, bless you, disciples, bless you. And bless these pledges that you have made or about to make. There's pledge cards with Renee. For God has given us more blessings than we can count. And that is why we give up ourselves. That we share in great gratitude for the generosity among us. We may still be in the midst of a pandemic, walking through dark valleys, but we know the light of God shines among us, and we celebrate what new things might come from the gifts of hope and love and commitment to God and Jesus and this unique, progressive Christian church. And so blessings. Blessings upon these pledges and the future of our beloved Irvine United Congregational Church. Amen.